Good day, my name is Keith Feely. There is my email address, and there's the address I use on Twitter, which I use all the time. This is KEEFTALK number 4, and the focus for this one, as you can see, follows on from the previous one. It's about exams, and this is something which I became very interested in many years ago because I was fortunate enough to actually pass what was called 11 plus. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you won't. I was the only child in my area that passed 11 plus. At the time we had no idea how it came to happen, and I got sent to a school in Romford. And one of the crucial things was that when I started teaching in 1974, back at the school at which I'd attended, it had become a comprehensive. And it meant that we were dealing with a very wide range of people in Romford, and my concern was quite simple and straightforward. I wanted to try to discover what we most needed to achieve good health, well-being and life chances. I was fortunate enough perhaps to have developed in a way which meant that I could go into teaching, but many of the people around me, the people I grew up with and the people I was teaching, weren't as fortunate as that. So my task as a teacher was how I could help those young people learn to achieve what I would hope to discover would be the most important things for their rest of their life. Consequently, what I then wanted to do was focus upon the area of concern at that time in the 1970s, the school I'd gone to, and that was exams. It's not changed at all today, and you'll see in a few minutes as to the reason why. So consequently, what I wanted to do was to look at exams themselves, analyse exams. So I started studying them intently. In the previous one I mentioned that, and also to try to discover why it was that they seemed to have such a high level of importance in the 1970s, and probably even more so in 2020. So consequently, what I started to do was to focus upon the history of exams. And one of the most fascinating things for me was I managed to attain a few books, which were quite rare for me at the time, and study what occurred. And it appears that in 1858, the first public examinations were the ones that were put into action. And as you can see there, the reason for that was because the public grammar schools, as they were called, wanted to have a way of ensuring that these cheap people who were going to Oxford and Cambridge were actually able to attain the level of academic achievement that they were focusing upon at Oxbridge. They incorporated people from Cambridge who came down to the schools, and they monitored very carefully, and they had very strict procedures as to how these exams would be carried out and how they would be marked. So that was the start of it, and that meant that the areas that we were most concerned with in Oxford and Cambridge were these following subjects. You can see that they're there. Most of them you will recognise because they're still there today, but it meant that what they were trying to do was to get an idea of how good people were able to recall information, and gradually they introduced a little bit about logic and cognitive skills in the level of analysis and understanding. But certainly in the mid-19th century it was very much about trying to recall information. Now, I was fortunate enough a number of years ago, 20 years ago, close to that, was to come across this book which is called Middle Classes, The Rise and Sprawl. In fact, the BBC ran a series, a 6-part series on television in the early part of this century, focusing upon it. And it actually provides, at least chapter 6 does, a very clear explanation as to how exams became so important at that moment in time in the late 19th century. And quite simply, the rise in the Industrial Revolution of the middle classes meant that the middle classes want to emulate much of the upper class. So they introduced a way of trying to get into Oxford and Cambridge, and later on there were more universities, and that meant that they had to pass these exams. And very quickly, as you can see there from the opening part of it, education was central to the achievements of middle classes, and they were the people who they were determined would be able to pass exams and get into Oxford, Cambridge, and later on the other examinations. For the professions, they needed to become doctors, they needed to become engineers and things, lawyers, etc. And again, in order for them to get into that profession, they needed to demonstrate, basically it was run by the upper class initially, that they had those skills. So consequently, passing these exams that we had at the time meant that they had demonstrated that they had the ability to go into those professions. Now, that meant that the public school model, which was really the key ones that were around at the time, were then replicated as near as possible, following on from the 1870 Education Act. And then in 1902, when secondary schools were being finally established, only up to the age of 13/14, and they were still few and far between, they actually copied almost verbatim what was going on in the public schools. So almost everything that happened in the public schools, they were trying to replicate in these secondary schools in 1902 and onwards. And consequently, exams were becoming a key part of what they were trying to establish within those schools, particularly as they were very much focused upon academic achievement. Literacy and numeracy were right at the heart of it. This Education Act is very important because, as I pointed out, it tried to have English, history, geography, foreign languages, science, maths right at the centre, and they became compulsory subjects, and of course they're still there today. At the same time in France, French psychologist Alfred Binet was asked by the French government to invent a test, a way of measuring how these children who weren't capable or perhaps were going to struggle immensely in school could be identified. So he invented what was called the first intelligence test. Now, Binet didn't actually think that this was possible, this whatever it was measuring wasn't actually inherited or anything like that, but he didn't think that it would be established as much as it was, because very quickly they became very popular internationally, particularly after the First World War. And the United States leapt upon this, and the IQ test, which you will be familiar with or heard of, became very well established. And it became in the 1920s that intelligence could easily be examined by these written tests, which basically was followed up by a chap called Cyril Burt. He's become infamous since then, in a book which was called How the Mind Works, because he defined human intelligence as all-round intellectual ability, which was inherited, it was innate, had nothing to do with the teaching, and you can actually measure it quite easily at a relatively young age. Actually, later on, it was discovered that Cyril Burt made up most of the results, and it was complete fabrication, and there was no scientific basis behind what he was stating. However, that didn't deter the schools in 1944 Education Act using this as a vehicle for deciding which 3 schools they should go to. And then after the Second World War, we had grammar, technical and secondary modern schools. If you passed this exam called the 11 plus, then you were able to go to a grammar school, or, like myself, quite a rare event, they went to a technical school, where you were actually given the public school criteria that we've already looked at, curriculum, and you focused upon examinations. They invented, just after that, in the early 1950s, 1951, exams called GCEs, General Certificate Education, O-Level and A-Level. The O-Level was taken at 16 and the A-Level was taken at 18. Again, like we've previously seen 100 years earlier, as entrance for examinations to go to university, and basically by that stage there were more universities available, and I was fortunate enough to go to Lancaster University at the end of the 60s as a result of doing well in those examinations. Now, one of the crucial things to bear in mind that this became a difficult thing to justify, certainly when I started teaching in 1974, as to why we still had those examinations and why the 11 plus still existed. And in fact, I started teaching at a comprehensive school where the 11 plus had finally been got rid of. But it did exist in certain areas and still does. But in 1988, as you can see from this slide here, the national curriculum was introduced so that all schools, all secondary schools, had to follow the same subjects and the same curriculum. And it meant at the same time they could introduce tests, examinations at 4 different ages: 7 at age 7, Key Stage 1, at age 11, Key Stage 2, at age 14, Key Stage 3, and Key Stage 4. We already had what previously had been GCEs and had now become GCSEs. Consequently, it meant that the testing regime now went into the secondary schools and into the primary schools all the way through a child's life. Consequently, in 1992, that was followed up by that government, and they introduced school performance tables. So how well children in that school did in those examinations was then published, and Ofsted was introduced at the time. Ofsted being the Office of Standards in Education, and they went around to the schools, inspected the schools, and basically made a judgment on the schools, primarily what they call standards, but primarily it was focused upon how well the children were doing in examinations. So consequently, what we have quite simply established is that our children were being focused upon and being assessed largely on these 6 skills, which, if you've seen KEEFTALK 3, I looked at in detail, and they are the 6 areas, 6 skills we'll call them, which actually are being present and essential that you're good at in exams. Consequently, if you do poorly in exams, it will be because of more than one of those 5 areas. And you will see that it's very much focused upon literacy and numeracy. Yet, by the early 90s, there was a lot of evidence to support the fact that these 8 skill areas were the ones that matter. And by the turn of this century, it was quite clear that what really mattered in life was how well people were developed in those 8 skills. And consequently, when we look at exams, it becomes quite an interesting thing, because they only really assess those top 3 skills: the effective learning skills, the ability to communicate and concentrate effectively, and our cognition skills, particularly in maths and science, is what they focused upon there. And even in those 3 areas, they weren't being assessed particularly intensely, but the other 5 areas weren't really being assessed very much at all. Consequently, one of the things you might wish to do is to do a little bit more research into the history exams, and this website there, this link there, is particularly useful because it's by an examiner who works for the Cambridge Assessment Board, and he starts off talking about a Times headline at the late part of the 2019, as you can see the date there, and they, like we've been doing for probably 70 years plus, is saying that examinations are very, very limited. They actually mean that schools are obsessed by exams, and teachers are almost straitjacketed by exams and trying to prepare their children for the exams, which means that the children themselves are not being developed in the skills, the 8 skills which we have on this side here, which basically they really need. Consequently, I want to finish off by pointing out that one of the great problems that we have with exams is that what we're dealing with is a very, very old-fashioned traditional measure, and it doesn't really measure much that we really need to know about our children, we really want to know about our children, and what we really want our children to achieve. Consequently, I hope that you will tune in to the more KEEFTALKs, where I will focus upon what our children really need to learn and to develop, and how we can actually develop them and how crucial they are in so many different areas. I hope you found that useful, and I hope you will tune in to some more in the future. Thank you very much.